There's a version of you that works harder than almost anyone you know, wakes up early, staying late, say yes to things most people would pass on, takes on the extra project, picks up the extra client, manages the extra responsibility. And on paper, at least from the outside, it looks like discipline. It looks like ambition. It looks like the kind of behavior that builds real wealth over time. But here's what nobody talks about. That same behavior, the overcommitting, the overextending, the constant yes, is quietly functioning like a ceiling on your net worth. Not a floor, a ceiling. And the reason most people never catch it is because it's disguised as productivity. It feels like progress. It registers in your brain as momentum, but underneath the surface, something very different is happening to your finances, your decisions, and your long-term capacity to actually build wealth. This isn't about working less. This isn't some lifestyle content about hustle culture being bad. That conversation's been done 1,000 times, and it's not what we're here for today. What we're actually going to talk about is a specific financial mechanism, a quiet, invisible system that activates every time a person overcommits their time, energy, and attention. And once that system activates, it starts making your money decisions for you, slowly, consistently, almost always in the wrong direction. Here's the thing that makes this hard to see. Overcommitting doesn't drain your bank account directly. It doesn't show up on a balance sheet. There's no line item called cost of exhaustion. But the decisions that get made inside that state of exhaustion, the shortcuts, the delayed choices, the avoided conversations, the investments never researched, the accounts never opened, the plans never built, those have a price, a real one. And over 5, 10, 20 years, that price compounds in exactly the same way your money does, except instead of growing your wealth, it quietly shrinks the ceiling of what's possible. By the end of this video, you'll understand the hidden rule that separates people who earn well but stay flat from people who earn moderately and still build lasting wealth. The difference isn't income, it's not even discipline, it's something quieter than both of those things. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. We're going to walk through 4 specific points where overcommitment enters your financial life and starts making decisions without your permission. We'll look at how this plays out psychologically, what it costs across time, and, more importantly, what actually changes when someone breaks the pattern. This is a long game conversation. If you're here for a quick fix or a shortcut, this probably isn't the right video. But if you've ever had the quiet suspicion that working harder isn't moving the financial needle the way it should, keep watching, because what you're about to hear might be the most important financial conversation you've had for a while. Let's get into it. Point 1. Overcommitment degrades decision quality, and decision quality is your financial life. Here's the first thing you need to understand. Your net worth is not primarily a product of your income. It's a product of the quality of decisions made consistently over time. That's it. That's the whole game. And the problem with overcommitment is that it directly, measurably degrades the quality of those decisions. There's a concept in behavioral economics called decision fatigue. And while that phrase has been thrown around a lot, most people don't actually understand what it costs them financially. It's not just about feeling tired. When your cognitive bandwidth is maxed out, when you've overcommitted your time, overscheduled your week, overextended your capacity, your brain doesn't have the resources to engage in what psychologists call slow thinking, the careful, considered, long-term kind. Instead, it defaults to fast thinking, reactive, immediate, present-focused. And here's why that matters in real money terms. Almost every wealth-building decision is a slow thinking decision. Evaluating whether to refinance, deciding when to increase your retirement contribution, researching whether a financial product actually serves your situation, thinking through the real cost of a liability before taking it on. These aren't fast decisions. They require cognitive space. And that space is exactly what overcommitment eliminates. Think about someone managing 3 jobs, 2 side projects, and a family, not because they're irresponsible, actually the opposite, because they're trying hard, they're committed, they're doing what they were told ambitious people do. But inside that schedule, every financial decision gets made in the cracks, late at night, between meetings, in 5-minute windows that don't allow for actual thinking. So, the 401k stays at the default contribution from the day they were hired. The high-interest debt stays because tackling it requires a plan, and plans take time. The savings account still earns 0.01% interest because opening a high-yield account was always something they'd do next week. 3 years pass, then 5. That's not laziness, that's the direct financial cost of overcommitment. And it's largely invisible because none of those non-decisions show up anywhere dramatic. Nobody notices the account that wasn't opened. Nobody sees the contribution that was never raised. But the math notices, quietly, every single month. The system rule here is simple. You cannot optimize what you don't have the capacity to think about. And capacity isn't created by working harder. It's created by protecting the cognitive and time resources that financial decisions actually require. The people who build wealth quietly, not the loudest earners, not the most visible grinders, they tend to guard their mental bandwidth like it's a financial asset, because it is one. Here's what's coming next, and this is the part most people completely overlook. Overcommitment doesn't just affect how you make decisions, it changes which decisions you're even willing to consider. And that's where the real ceiling starts to form. Point 2. The income illusion, when busyness replaces wealth strategy. There's a particular trap that high-performing, overcommitted people fall into that almost never gets named directly. It's the belief, usually unconscious, that if income keeps going up, the financial picture must be improving. And the overcommitment feeds this belief perfectly, because the busier you are, the more income activity there tends to be. More hours, more projects, more revenue, and all of that movement creates a feeling of financial progress. But income and wealth are not the same thing, not even close. Income is a flow. Wealth is a stock. You can have significant flow and almost no stock. In fact, that's exactly the situation millions of high-earning, overcommitted people find themselves in. They earn well. They spend accordingly. They stay busy enough that they never stop to notice the gap between what's coming in and what's actually being built. Here's how this works psychologically. When you're overcommitted, your relationship with money becomes almost entirely transactional and present tense. You think about money in terms of this month's bills, this week's income, this project's payment. The long arc, the 5-year picture, the compounding trajectory, the net worth curve, that requires a different kind of attention, a zoomed-out view. And zoomed-out thinking requires stillness. It requires space. Overcommitment eliminates both. What fills that space instead is income activity. And income activity feels so much like wealth building that the two become confused. The person working 80 hours a week earning $180,000 often has less actual financial architecture, fewer assets, less diversification, less strategic clarity than someone earning $90,000 who protected enough cognitive space to actually think about where their money was going. This isn't an argument for earning less. It's a recognition that earning more while building less is a very real, very common outcome of overcommitment. And the math is quietly brutal over time. 10 years of high income with low savings rates and no investment strategy doesn't produce wealth. It produces lifestyle. And lifestyle doesn't compound. The system rule here: busyness creates the feeling of financial progress while potentially delaying the actual architecture of wealth. They are not the same activity. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tends to create some discomfort in people who've spent years equating hard work with financial security. The discomfort is useful. It means something in the logic is shifting. But there's a deeper layer to this that most people don't reach until something forces them to look at it. And it's not about your schedule or your income or your savings rate. It's about something much more internal, something that overcommitment does to your identity, to how you think about what you deserve and what's even possible for you. That's where we're going next. The story: the man who couldn't stop carrying. Picture a man, call him Marcus, mid-30s, lives outside Atlanta. Smart guy, works in operations management at a logistics company, has a side business doing IT consulting on weekends, takes occasional freelance projects when the money looks right. His calendar is full. His income is solid, somewhere around $140,000 a year between everything. His friends think he's doing well, his family thinks he's a success story. But Marcus has a problem he can't quite name. Every year, he earns more than the year before. And every year, the number in his investment accounts barely moves. His savings rate hovers around 4% because after expenses, which have grown quietly alongside his income, there's just never quite enough margin to increase it. He's been meaning to talk to a financial advisor for 2 years. He's been meaning to roll over an old 401k from a job he left in 2019. He's been meaning to actually read the terms on a whole life policy someone sold him years ago that he suspects isn't serving him. None of it gets done. Not because Marcus is irresponsible, but because Marcus is always carrying something. There's always a deadline, a client, a project, a family obligation that legitimately needs his attention. And in that constant state of carrying, financial thinking gets pushed to a category his brain quietly labels someday. Someday becomes a year becomes 3. Here's the thing about Marcus's situation that makes it a perfect picture of what overcommitment actually costs. His financial problems aren't income problems. He earns well. They're not even spending problems exactly. His lifestyle is reasonable. His problem is architectural. There's no structure underneath the income, no system directing where the money goes, how it compounds, what it builds over time. And building that structure requires something Marcus has never protected: unscheduled thinking time specifically dedicated to his financial life. In survival mode, which is what chronic overcommitment actually is neurologically, the brain deprioritizes future self-thinking. It focuses on present threats and present demands. This isn't a character flaw. It's biology. But the financial consequence of living primarily in present tense thinking for years at a time is that the future self inherits very little from the version of you who is too busy to plan. Marcus eventually cleared his calendar for one Saturday, not to work, not to earn, just to sit with his financial picture. What he found, the old accounts, the unconsolidated assets, the insurance product he didn't need, the contribution rate 5% below what he could actually afford, represented years of invisible loss. Not dramatic loss, quiet loss. The kind that only shows up when you finally stop moving long enough to look. The stillness was the investment. Point 3. Overcommitment creates a specific kind of financial risk nobody talks about. There's a risk category that most financial conversations skip entirely. Not market risk, not inflation risk, not even sequence of returns risk, which at least gets mentioned occasionally. The risk category I'm talking about is capacity risk. The risk that you will not have the time, energy, or cognitive bandwidth to respond appropriately when your financial situation requires your attention. And this risk goes up dramatically, almost proportionally with overcommitment. Here's a concrete way to think about this. Financial life, like most complex systems, doesn't stay static. It has moments that require active intervention, a job change that creates a rollover decision, a market correction that requires staying calm and potentially rebalancing, a real estate opportunity with a narrow window, a tax situation that needs strategic handling before year-end, an insurance policy lapsing,
a beneficiary designation that needs updating after a life change. None of these events announce themselves at convenient times. And for someone who is chronically overcommitted, the ability to respond to these moments quickly, clearly, without panic is severely compromised. Not because they're not smart enough, but because the bandwidth required to make a good decision in a compressed time frame simply isn't available. What happens instead is one of two things. Either the decision gets made poorly, quickly, reactively, without adequate research, or it gets delayed. And in personal finance, delayed decisions are almost always costly. The rollover that sits in cash too long, the tax loss harvesting opportunity missed, the refinance window that closes before the paperwork gets organized. These aren't catastrophic individual events, but they accumulate. Over a decade, the cost of consistently poor or delayed financial responses adds up in ways that are genuinely significant. Here's the behavioral piece that makes this worse. Overcommitted people tend to have a particular relationship with financial urgency. Because everything feels urgent when you're overextended, genuine financial urgency gets harder to distinguish from noise. The signal gets lost. And so even when something requires real, timely attention, it can fail to register as different from the 17 other things competing for that same bandwidth. The system rule. Financial capacity, the actual ability to respond well to your money when it needs you, is itself a form of wealth protection, and it erodes in direct proportion to how overcommitted your life becomes. This is a subtle point, but an important one. Most wealth protection strategies focus on external factors: diversification, insurance, emergency funds. Those matter. But your own capacity to engage with your finances when it counts, that's an internal protection mechanism, and it's one of the first things that breaks down under chronic overcommitment. Now, here's where this gets interesting, because there's a fourth dimension to this that we haven't touched yet, and it might be the most consequential one of all. Point 4. The identity cost. How overcommitment rewires what you believe you're allowed to have. This one is quieter than the others. It doesn't show up in spreadsheets. It doesn't have a line item. But it might be the most financially consequential dimension of overcommitment because it operates at the level of identity, at the level of what you believe is actually available to you. Here's what happens over years of chronic overcommitment. Your sense of self becomes deeply fused with your output, with the carrying, with the doing. And at some point, usually gradually, without any single moment you can point to, your financial imagination starts to contract. Not because the opportunities disappear, but because the version of you that is always exhausted, always stretched, always in motion, starts to believe, quietly and completely, that the kind of deliberate, strategic wealth building you see in other people is for someone else, someone with more time, someone with a different situation, someone who isn't managing everything you're managing. This is one of the most financially damaging beliefs a person can carry, because it's not even recognized as a belief. It feels like a realistic assessment of your circumstances, and it gets reinforced every single day by the evidence of your own busyness. The financial behavior that follows from this identity is predictable. You stop researching opportunities because you've pre-decided you don't have time to act on them. You avoid financial conversations because they surface a gap between where you are and where you'd like to be, and that gap is painful when you're already running at capacity. You make peace with financial mediocrity not through acceptance, but through exhaustion, and you call it being practical. Meanwhile, the ceiling gets lower, not because the market changed, not because your income dropped, but because the internal architecture, the beliefs, the confidence, the vision of what's possible contracted quietly over years of overcommitment. The people who reverse this pattern almost always describe a similar experience. At some point, they reduced their commitments, sometimes by choice, sometimes by circumstance, and in the space that opened up, they encountered a version of themselves they hadn't met in a while. A version that could think, that could plan, that could imagine a 10-year financial arc and feel something other than overwhelmed by it. That version of themselves wasn't more talented or more disciplined, they just had room to operate.
The system rule here is the hardest one to accept. You cannot build a financial life bigger than the identity you're operating from. And chronic overcommitment slowly shrinks that identity. Not loudly, not dramatically, just consistently, over time, in the quiet erosion of possibility. This is the ceiling nobody tells you about, and the ceiling was never made of money. We're almost at the end, and there's one thing left to say. The part about what actually changes when someone breaks this pattern. That's next.
So here's where we land. Overcommitment isn't a productivity problem. It's not a time management problem. At its core, it's a financial architecture problem, one that operates invisibly across decision quality, income strategy, risk capacity, and identity. And it compounds quietly, in the same way money does, except in reverse. The people who figure this out don't usually do it through a dramatic life overhaul. They don't quit their jobs or move to the countryside or stop being ambitious. What they do is simpler and harder than any of that. They begin treating their own cognitive capacity, their attention, their stillness, their ability to think carefully about their financial life as a resource worth protecting. The same way they'd protect their income, the same way they'd protect their savings rate. Because here's the quiet truth underneath everything we've covered today. The financial decisions that shape a life aren't made on the days when everything is urgent. They're made in the moments of clarity between the urgency. And those moments only exist if you protect them. 5 years from now, the version of you who guarded that capacity, who periodically cleared the calendar not to earn more, but to think more clearly, will be sitting in front of a financial picture that looks meaningfully different from the version of you who kept adding commitments and hoping the math would sort itself out. The math doesn't sort itself out, but you can. If this landed in a way that felt personally relevant, the next step isn't complex. Pick one financial decision you've been deferring, not because you don't care about it, but because you haven't had the space to think about it clearly. Give it 2 uninterrupted hours this week. That's where it starts. Not with more income, with more clarity.